So I stayed in a relationship. Had its good points for sure, but it was a pretty crummy relationship overall with a very verbally, I shouldn't say, a fairly verbally aggressive woman. And I stayed in this relationship off and on for 7 years. We were living together. I even proposed at one point. And the secondary gains for me became very clear after I began to stand up for myself in this relationship and no longer take that kind of stuff and all that. And the secondary gains were that when I began to stand up for myself and began to define my preferences, I so remember we were sitting on the couch, we were watching a Queen live concert. And I love this. One of my favorite songs in the whole world is Somebody to Love. And it was a live version. I'd never heard a live version before, and I was really excited to hear it. And this woman was sitting down, and she was complaining about some damn thing that I was doing or whatever, right? And I turned to her and I said, you know what? When we first met, I was a broke-ass, unemployed student of the arts. And now, like since then, in the last 7 years, I've gone from that to running a software company, to running the technical side of a software company. And you are a secretary. There's nothing wrong with being a secretary, I said, but I've traveled some real distance since we first met, and you completed a degree, and now you're working as a secretary. And I said, I think I'm kind of getting that the level of complaints that you have about me over the last 7 years have barely diminished. But your life has barely improved. In fact, in many ways, it's gotten worse because 7 years ago, you were in the middle of getting your degree. Now you've had it, and you've had a couple of years to deal. She wanted to get into the film business, and you haven't. You've wanted to write a screenplay for 7 years. In 7 years, I've written 3 novels. So your level of complaining is about the same now as it was when I was a broke student having no idea fundamentally what I was going to do with my life. You still have the same complaints. So I get that it's not about me and it's not about my life, that the complaining is your thing. And I said and I wasn't mad, and I said it kind of just like that. And I can't tell you, just sticking that one flag in the ground, sticking that one border in the sand, one line in the sand, oh my God, it just began to unravel everything. The secondary gains that I was getting by staying in that relationship was that by staying in that relationship, I got to stay in all of my existing relationships. But since that evening, gosh, I can't even remember, 12 years ago now, 11 years ago, something like that. 12? Anyway, since that evening, I have no relationships left from the dozens of relationships I had at the time. The secondary gains for me, look, this may not be this dramatic for you, I'm just sort of pointing out, was that I couldn't draw a line in the sand in one of my relationships. Nothing ever happens to one of your relationships. It only ever happens to all of your relationships. If it's a philosophical line, like if it's a line of principle. I mean, in that moment, I really got. And that knowledge arrived to me fully formed. It's like giving birth to a 30-year-old, right? That knowledge arrived to me fully formed that I had thought that she was complaining about me. And I got that this was just a broken woman spinning her wheels in the sand, getting nowhere in her life and taking it out. It had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with me. But once I got that her criticisms of me, her perspective, her opinions of me had nothing to do with me, that I was just a stand-in for her own fears and failures, that changed everything. Because once I had that line with one person, that line was there. I mean, I'm a UPB life form like everybody else. I can't make a decision about one thing. So my secondary gains was that pretending that it was about me when I was around this kind of narcissistic person was only having the illusion of a relationship. And once I drew that line in the sand, I was like, wait a minute, the empirical evidence says that this has nothing to do with me.
So I went out with a woman in my 20s, as I mentioned before, and we ended up making a movie together. She wanted to get into the movie business, so I wrote a script, and we hired actors, and it cost a fortune to make this film. And it did pretty well. It was a finalist in the Hollywood Film Festival. It's still shown on TV pretty much once a year. It's about a soldier coming home from World War II, so it's shown on Remembrance Day, usually. And so this woman was pretty much okay to take the money from me to make the film, and I was keen to do it because I sort of felt that it was virtuous to do it, right? To give and to be generous and all that. I had a real mistaken idea about what it was to be kind and generous, so I basically offered myself up for exploitation fairly regularly and thought that it was a moral thing. So what happened was I was very generous and would be very kind and would give, and then I would find that not so much with the boomerang giving, not so much with the returning. And so what happened was I began to, as I sort of grew up and began to become more mature and confident with myself and with the very idea of reciprocity, which, as I'm sure you're aware, was not exactly lesson one in my family of origin, then I would begin to ask for things in return. So one of the things that occurred with the woman I was living with in my 20s, well, I went out with, lived with her for a short period of time, is that we did this film together, and then I asked her to read a novel of mine that an agent was interested in, to give it an edit. She was an English major, so she knew that stuff pretty well, and to help me out with it. And she said, yeah, I will, and so on. But, I just kind of noticed that she never got to it. And so, one day I sort of sat her down and said, okay, I have a bit of a problem with the disparity here. She's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I poured a huge amount of money into your film, and I helped you make it, and I was the producer, and I went out to pick up McDonald's food for everyone when they had to work late, and I did this, that, and the other. And, we flew down to Los Angeles. You weren't making that much money at the time, but I footed the bill. I flew down to Los Angeles. We entered it in the Hollywood Film Festival and all this. So I feel like I put a lot of effort into that. And so, of course, she gets cold-eyed, and, the lips get all thin and tense and so on. And I said, well, and what I've asked in return, I'm not asking you to put a fortune into my art, but if I've sort of said now for 2 months, would you mind reading this novel to give it an edit because an agent's interested in it? And you haven't. And we went back and forth for a while, but the upshot was, and everybody knows the details aren't that important, but the upshot was that she said, well, I just haven't really felt motivated to read your book. You haven't really put it in a way that motivates me. And, I got a sort of click experience with that sentence where my eyes just sort of went a little wide, and I physically remember the blood draining from my face as I realized the enormous disparity in our value system. It's the kind of thing that you want to talk about right at the beginning of a relationship, not when you've been in it for a while. But that I felt that it was important to be generous to and to give to your partner as much as possible, and that she felt that I had to motivate it and make it fun for her to do something like read a book of mine. And I did say that to her at the time. I said, well, it wasn't that you motivated me to make the film. And then of course she's like, oh, I knew you were just going to bring that film thing up, and I knew that if I took that from you, that it was going to cause problems. I knew I shouldn't have blah 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 blah. And so of course we never got to the topic, and we broke up shortly thereafter.